Today's guest is Konstantin Guericke, one of the pioneers of the early days of social networking and co-founder of LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn needs no introduction, but to share some notable stats, the company went public in 2011 with an IPO price of $45 and a valuation of over $4 billion, and was purchased by Microsoft in 2016 for $26 billion. Within its first month, LinkedIn had over 4,500 users, and by the end of the next year, membership hit 1 million users. Konstantin led LinkedIn's marketing to profitability, focusing the first few years on branding, viral marketing, user engagement, and media relations. Later, he also managed LinkedIn Groups, the company's international expansion, and the corporate sales team. Welcome to Trivia Tangents, the edutainment podcast where we turn everyday passions into surprising trivia deep dives. I'm your host, Lena, and each episode I quiz a guest on something they know way too much about. We all know that on trivia night, the bigger the team, the better you'll play. That's why I bring the team together here on Trivia Tangents. So get ready for some fun facts you'll definitely want for your next trivia night. Welcome, Konstantin. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Lena.
So excited to have you here today and excited to chat about the inspiration behind LinkedIn, how it's used today, and of course, it wouldn't be a Trivia Tangents episode without some fun trivia questions.
Looking forward to it.
So Konstantin has no idea what these trivia questions are, but they are multiple choice. So even if you're not sure, you can do process of elimination. That's why I love multiple choice. So Konstantin, let's start from the beginning. Can you share your path from growing up in Germany to eventually studying at Stanford University?
Yeah, so when I was in Germany, I was pretty much focused on playing tennis in my little town and surrounding areas. And then one day I heard about the ability to do this youth exchange program. So for a year, I lived with a family in Pennsylvania. And there I got to know about American colleges. And so I looked at where I might be able to apply. My parents are high school teachers, so not particularly wealthy. So I need a scholarship, but that's a problem because as a foreign student, a lot of colleges don't provide scholarships. So it was basically only the really wealthy universities I could apply to, and I applied to several, and I was fortunate to get into Stanford, and it was one of my top choices because one of the things I had a strong interest in technology back then. I grew up reading science fiction. I memorized all the different Apollo missions and all that good stuff. So I was really into technology, and so it seemed like it was being created, here in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, of course. Silicon Valley is the hub of technology, and that reputation definitely holds up to today. And I saw that you once said that software is the brains of technology and hardware is kind of the body. And I was wondering, with AI emerging today, do you think that could be the soul of technology?
That's a deep question. Not sure about the role, but I definitely think one of the things I like about AI. So at Stanford, I studied AI, and I also mixed in subjects like sociology and psychology, including like developmental psychology, because I figured we can learn a lot from because we've evolved, in so many iterations. Nature is pretty smart, so maybe we can use and structure the way computers learn from the way little babies learn, because they learn so much in the first couple of years of their life. So I think I think AI is still just a kind of software, but
Mhm.
each time the software gets smarter, so to speak. And I think
Totally.
one of the things until AI, it's been not very sort of good with emotions and really being more human-like. And so I think that's an aspect I'm very interested in because we all have emotions, and in order to be effective, in terms of working with computers, it's good if it can understand, what a certain look means or a certain tone means and how to respond appropriately so the interaction is more natural. Because when computers first came out, they were considered like this universal machine
Mhm.
versus all the other machines were dedicated to, I don't know, stamping something in the factory or a hammer or something like that. But a computer could really be any kind of machine. But the big drawback was in order to make it do what you want to do, you had to learn a computer language. And
Mhm.
back then I learned a language called Prolog, which was used for AI. which was easier than some of the other languages, but still not human-like. But now, with AI, you can sort of literally talk to your computer and make a software and make it do whatever machine you want it to be.
Yeah. AI is transformational, and I am a little bit worried that, especially the self-driving autonomous vehicles that we have here in San Francisco, I'm a little worried that they're developing their own, emotions. I had one recently cut me off in a 25 mile per hour street just to get one car ahead of me, basically. So awesome that you studied AI way back when. And I'm interested to learn more about how you got your first job, especially since obviously at that time, LinkedIn job board didn't exist. So did you face any job hunting challenges during your early career days in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, very much so, because I had this mix of computer science with sociology and psychology. And, the professors all thought that's great. This is what society needs. We need to bring together sort of like people who understand people and how they work and organizations, how they work with this new ability of computing. The problem on the job market, it's often companies have, a slot and with certain specific requirements. So for engineering positions, I wasn't really qualified enough because I took all these sociology and psychology courses. So I didn't qualify. And I frankly wasn't that interested to work purely as an engineer. And then I was interested in marketing. And marketing, they wanted someone with business school and a couple of years of work experience. So it was pretty tricky. I applied,
Yeah.
some larger companies, but in the end, there was a little startup that had an ad in the newspaper, the student newspaper, and I just responded to the ad by, writing out a physical letter and sending it in. The funny thing is, actually, I misspelled the name of the company on my application because back then the ad was still not set with a computer. It was set like with little metal letters. And so sometimes what would happen, the kerning would be off. So I thought it was two words, the company, but it turned out to be one word. So I was kind of mortified when I showed up for my interview and the doorbell and I said, oh my God, I mistyped the the
Yeah.
company name. But they still gave me an interview, so that was good.
Wow, that's amazing. It's great to hear that, Stanford had a student resource putting job apps in their newspaper. That's wonderful, and I hope they still do that today. And I hear you often do guest lectures at Stanford as well. What kind of advice do you have for people who are looking to advance their careers in Silicon Valley?
I like that you say advance your career because a lot of people just think about the next job and then they work and then they, forget about anything, other than maybe trying to get more responsibilities at the company.
Hmm.
But I think what you really want to think about is you want to think about your career. For that, if you work in a company setting, I think it's really important to strengthen those relationships with coworkers to kind of go beyond, at this company, you have like certain projects and you have meetings. But I think prefer more stronger connections where you really get to know them because the people that you work with are going to be the best people to help you find a new job later on. And
Hmm.
most people don't stay at a company 10 years anymore or 20.
Hmm.
It's like 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. So all these coworkers will be basically scattered in the winds, and you might be scattered in the winds. So I think, really nurturing those relationships. A lot of people sort of forget about their coworkers once they start the next job.
Yeah.
So you want to basically curate a network of people that you have a working relationship with, stay in touch with them, and help each other in small ways. Sometimes it could be introducing them to a new job, but it could be sometimes just introducing them to a person that might be helpful for doing that job. It could be sending some industry news or some companies that might be relevant to them. So and that's just why you can't have an infinite number of connections because I think
Hmm.
each of this network needs to be someone that you keep in touch with. And I would say at least meet physically once a year and touch base digitally, 4 or 5 times per year. So I would say
Yeah.
that's a minimum requirement. So if you think about the number of days that we have per year, that typically means maybe a group of between 100 and 200 people. You can't really, keep in touch with more people than that.
Right. That's interesting you say in person once a year. I was going to have a follow-up question that I maybe was going to bring up in a later section when we talk about online versus offline connection, but personally have a fully remote job. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on, the connections in person versus, online. And it sounds like once a year is good enough in person, which sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, fully remote is definitely a whole new other option that was
Sure.
very rare, a while back. I mean, this is sort of something that COVID brought us,
Yeah.
hopefully a little bit of a benefit. So I think you can still build a trusted relationship with someone purely online if you have worked together. I think if you're just meeting someone online and, you don't have any sort of working relationship, it's hard to build sort of, because I think, you have to have gone through some difficulties together and really
Mhm.
see how people respond under stress and to really understand them as a person. I do think it's harder in an online setting, I
Mhm.
imagine, just because it's sort of like you just Zoom is kind of formal and you don't have sort of, informally, you just walk by the office and maybe you happen to see like a picture on someone's desk and ask, "Oh, is this your daughter?" or,
Mhm.
something like that, and get into a little bit of a personal conversation. You sort of see what they look like because people for Zoom, they dress a little bit, at least the part that's exposed to the camera.
Right.
And so it's a little bit of a performance versus the office, you can't be performing all the time. Sometimes you're just like at your desk. So
Yeah,
I
sure.
do think it brings challenges, but I think it's doable, but it requires some investment.
For sure, for sure. Well, we will definitely get more into online versus offline connections in a later section. So I want to save that conversation till then. But going back into, the job hunt, pre-digital era, I can only imagine how hard it must have been for people to find a job in the pre-digital era. You found your job through the newspaper. And this compels me to mention LinkedIn's Jobs for You feature,
Okay.
which has helped over 4 million people get a job. That is a massive number. I'm one of those people. And this feature has had and continues to have an incredible impact on people's lives, which brings me to my very first trivia question for you, Konstantin. Are you
Okay.
ready?
I'm ready.
All right, trivia question one. What year did LinkedIn begin allowing businesses to post job listings? A, 2003, B, 2004, or C, 2005?
Oh, I was gonna guess like it's somewhere in that area. So I think it's 2004, but I'm not 100% sure, but that's my guess. I'm sticking
You're
with it.
correct.
Okay.
Good job. Good job. So I mean, obviously, you know that you were at the company at that time. So I got this from a history of LinkedIn article from LinkedIn.
Okay.
And it said during 2004, LinkedIn began allowing businesses to post job listings. This obviously became a major draw as professionals could view openings at companies they followed. So this really got me thinking about the days prior to the LinkedIn job board. I personally work in tech recruiting, and I asked around my colleagues who have been in the industry for a while on how they did their jobs or recruited for their jobs before LinkedIn, which leads me to another interesting trivia question for you. Back to back trivia.
All right.
All right, trivia question two. Before LinkedIn and digital applicant tracking systems, what was the most common way recruiters kept track of potential candidates?
Okay.
A pager, B, a Rolodex, or C, the yellow pages?
Wait, this is how recruiters kept track of applicants?
Yes, how recruiters kept track of
Okay,
applicants.
all right. I would say the Rolodex.
You're correct. Bravo, good job. So, yeah, the way I framed this question, I really wanted the answer to be like undeniably Rolodex because I wanted to talk about the Rolodex. So, mini deep dive here on the Rolodex for my Gen Z and Zillennial listeners. Recruiters, aka what they used to call headhunters, or maybe some people still call them headhunters, which I think is personally kind of an abrasive name. But, anyways, recruiters maintained long standing personal networks of professionals and kept track of their career moves in order to match them to roles. It seemed like a very labor intensive process, constantly chatting on the phone to stay up to date, but also to ask the most important question: who do you know? So, according to the internet, and also confirmed by my professional sources, my colleagues, a good recruiter kept track of their contacts and background in a Rolodex. So it's crazy to think about before LinkedIn. If you wanted to find a specialist, you probably needed to know someone who knew someone and then hoped they pick up the phone. So that was the norm back then, right? And fast forward to today, we just type a name into LinkedIn. So, Konstantin, I'm wondering, how did you identify that as a problem? And what was the original vision for LinkedIn?
Yeah, so the original vision was to use it for any kind of professional purpose. So, on the one hand, that means what we talked about earlier, kind of advancing your career, which is, a little bit broader than finding a job. It's also, kind of staying in touch with your connections, being able to
Mhm.
do small things for your professional connections, etc, and also doing your job, being able to get access to information of which you often need sort of trust, so that because the most important information, the most valuable information is not something that you find on the internet or in ChatGPT. It's in someone's head, because that gives you the advantage, because everybody else is using Google or ChatGPT.
Mhm.
So that information doesn't give you an advantage, but there's a lot of information locked up in our heads that hasn't been published, and hopefully not everything is in our head will be published. That would be a
Right.
little bit of a scary future. In terms of finding a job, it was often when people were looking for a job, they would ask, well, they would do two things. One, they would kind of do a cold outreach, and in the beginning, that was the newspaper ads. But then we had several companies from the beginning of the internet that emerged. They were sort of the online equivalent of the newspaper ads for jobs, and like Monster was one of the really big ones at the time. And so you'd kind of search like LinkedIn, you'd search for a job, and it would give you listings that match, and they showed it. So the difference was you had no idea how you're connected to these people, and so
Mhm.
people would just send in the application and find out that they often don't get any kind of response, because the companies who post these get hundreds of resumes coming in. So what the smart people did is they really didn't apply to every single company. They looked at, different companies where they're really a good match on paper, but also looking at where they might know someone. Now the problem is, if we only know 100 to 200 people, that really limits our universe for jobs. But when you look at each of our 100 to 200 people knows another 100 to 200 people, it means you're over 100 times more likely to have a connection in your what we call the second degree.
Mhm.
So most people would then sort of ask their contacts who they thought might know someone. Let's say you wanted to work at I don't know, Netflix or something like that. And among your 100 people is nobody who works at Netflix. But then you think about, okay, which of my 100 people might know someone at Netflix who kind of works kind of with entertainment software, or, maybe lives near Los Gatos,
Yeah.
or, has mentioned something about Netflix, like having known someone who worked there together. And then you'd ask them, and it's a little awkward just to call them on the phone and say, hey, do you know someone at Netflix? So usually you just, have a lunch together, or go for a walk or something, and just ask them, after
Right.
you talk about what you're looking for, is, oh, do you know someone at Netflix? And they say no. And then usually what you do is, well, do you know someone who might know someone at Netflix? And that's what we call the third degree. So it's, like you find someone else that your friends know who knows someone at Netflix.
Right.
So it just seemed very inefficient, because you'd have to, it took so long to just have so many lunches and coffees and whatnot.
Yeah.
And we just wanted to make it more visible, that right away you can see, oh, here's Netflix, here are my four people who know people at Netflix. Let me pick one of them, because online you can already see it. Now, one problem that has emerged over time is that some people have become pretty liberal with whom they connect on LinkedIn. So it's not just the people they know and trust, but maybe someone who they just met at a conference, talked for 10 minutes with, and then linked up on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Or maybe some people who just send them a LinkedIn invitation, and they just didn't want to say no and they accepted, or maybe when they're doing their job search, just really approaching even random people. So
Yep.
in that case, it's a little harder to tell which of your connections actually know someone, at the company that you want to work with, or that you want to do a business partnership with.
Right. Yeah, but that helps me understand like the original vision behind it. It
Mhm.
was really to show exactly who you knew in real life and have a visual representation of that online and just take out that kind of the manual labor of constantly going on walks or lunches with people. And that just took up a lot of time and effort. So that leads me to my next question. And I kind of wanted this to be a trivia question, but I couldn't find the answer anywhere. So
Okay.
I was wondering,
Open-ended.
I was wondering who made the first LinkedIn profile?
Oh. Actually, I don't know for sure. I think it was probably one of the engineers, but I know we were 5 founders, and then we had 6 more people, and they were on the founding team. So we were 11 people to start with. So
Mhm.
I'm sure it was one of the 11 people.
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure it wasn't me. And since the engineers were creating the software, it was probably whoever was in charge of building that part of the code and create a profile. But you can see, I think if you look on LinkedIn, there's a section where you can see how long you've been a member. So that's kind of fun to see when you joined. We launched in, I think it was May 2003.
Mhm.
So we pretty much, the profiles were actually, no, the first profiles were probably created on a QA environment. And then,
Mhm.
and then we, for sure, the 11 joined right away because, the way we grew is we each invited our contacts,
Yep.
which for some engineers, maybe it was 50 to 100. For some of us, more in sales and marketing, maybe more 100 to 200 because we're a little
Yeah.
more relationship oriented, and it grew from there.
Awesome. Amazing. And I watched one of your previous interviews and I saw that you mentioned Daniel Pink's book
Okay.
called The Free Agent Nation as inspiration. And I did try and look this up online and it kept giving me like fantasy football references because free agent is a fantasy
Okay.
football like sports term. So I thought that was funny. But anyways, I was curious, could you share how this book, Free Agent Nation, shaped or helped shape your idea of LinkedIn as everyone's quote unquote agent?
Yes. Oh, this is actually perfect because when I was answering your question about your career, I was starting to say, like, oh, if you work at a company and you find a new job, actually, what we saw happening and what Daniel Pink, he wrote this book around the time we started LinkedIn. And he was talking about how in the past, throughout humanity, we each were were not working for companies. We were working for ourselves. Maybe someone makes shoes and someone cooks, and then you would trade, like, okay, like, I'm hungry, give me something to eat, and someone else, and I'll make you a shoe. And so you would trade with each other, and that's how the economy worked forever. And then, really, with the Industrial Revolution, this is what it's described in this book, is when, all of a sudden you had complex machinery with a steam engine in the factories. And so it was no longer one person who just had a factory and worked at all the machines, right? You needed to organize all these people. So when people were trading with each other, it was like a network. And then once you had all the factories and so forth, it became like an org chart. So
Mhm.
everybody was organized into org charts, and people's careers kind of, people were thinking about, okay, I'll start at the bottom of the org chart, and over time I move higher and higher and manage people and get bigger budgets and so forth.
Yeah.
And with the information revolution, Daniel Pink said it's we're looking at returning to the network because people are going to be working more for themselves. And I know there's a lot of concerns about, like, what jobs are going to be available now, right? With AI
Mhm.
supplementing, especially, a lot of the entry level jobs. And I encourage everyone to think about finding a job, but kind of reframing it as finding a way to make a living. And that may be a job at a company, but increasingly, I think it'll be something that you do yourself. And for example, so one of the examples Daniel Pink used in his book was the actors, because actors are kind of free agents. They work for themselves. They come together for a project where they make a movie, and then they select, a next project. And they
Mhm.
often want, like, to work with a certain filmmaker, maybe, or with other actors. They don't want to be typecast in just one role. So they think about their career not in terms of climbing up the ladder, but looking at the next project together. And I think more and more of us are self employed and need to look at it that way. And that's why this network is really important. And finally, one thing that Daniel Pink said is that, the actors usually don't just do everything themselves. They have an agent, and the agent is the one that sort of represents them to the outside, who helps them, who kind of markets them to others to put their best foot forward. And also when people come in and approach them, it's like, hey, would you like to do this movie? If it's a movie that is maybe, you're already kind of a little bit established and, it's not likely to have a big audience or, like has some bad, you might get a bad image from that movie. The agent will not even show you the script. They will sort of
Hmm.
say if, this person isn't interested or available. And so we thought of LinkedIn as kind of your professional agent that helps represent you to the outside, but also can filter opportunities through your network so that the ones that your trusted contacts forward to you who know you are more likely to send you the things that are actually of interest to you.
Yeah, I love that. That
Yeah.
makes so much sense, and I'm so excited to read this book. I tried to look for it on audiobooks, and that is when I had the fantasy football as my results, which is pretty funny. So it seemed like he was, not only he was basically in that book giving advice on, how to go about your professional career. And I know you've shared some compelling advice for entrepreneurs specifically. I'm pretty sure you said work on a problem you'd regret not solving. So I'm curious, for you, Konstantin, why were trustworthy professional connections such a personal mission for you?
Well, it just seemed like it was always that's how things really came together, and,
Yeah.
and and my career wasn't really ever working at large companies, so it was not a big org chart to climb, but these would be little startups. And little startups, you don't get a ton of people applying, for the jobs because, everybody wants to work at Microsoft or OpenAI or, one of those companies.
Mhm.
And but little startups have a little hard time. So, but what you do rely on is that trust, where someone knows someone at the company, and then then they're much more interested in the company because that person says, yeah, this person, is going to go places, or this company is doing really well. You wouldn't seek out often a little company because they all kind of look the same. So that personal connection is really important, and that trust that, this person knows both the company, maybe works for the company, not. And little startups are also, each employee is so important. If you're 11 people and you hire a 12th person, like everybody's going to know each other. Everybody has to work together. And so the wrong hire can be really bad. If you're a company with 15,000, one new hire isn't making that big of an impact.
Mhm.
But with 11 people, you also need to have a really good cultural fit, the way people communicate, your work hours, everything. I've worked at startups where, personal hygiene became an issue, where some people sharing an office.
Yeah.
So you really, that trust is very important for jobs, but also when you are trying to do your job, it's the same thing. Let's say you want to get the word out about your company, which is part of my job. Is a lot, maybe someone at a regional paper who's in charge of the business pages, would they write about LinkedIn? Most of the time they wouldn't just write about it unless someone said, look, this company I think is going places, they have some really interesting things, take a look. If you just
Mhm.
write to these reporters, often you'll never get a reply unless you have a trusted introduction. So I felt this is how the real world works, but
Mhm.
like as we talked about before, it's so inefficient. So is there a way to make it more efficient? Kind of like my engineering background, right? I wanted to
Mhm.
make things more efficient, but at the same time, you can't when you make things efficient, like the job board, it disrupted how the real world really works.
Mhm.
And so how did you do the kind of the sociology and psychology part of my degree, keep that in the mix so that you gain the efficiency without losing on, what makes us people tick and trust each other and work together and so forth.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, and that key root of the trusted connections is still something that is so important today, and we'll definitely get into that later on how to ensure that your connections stay strong even though we have that online aspect. And that's something I'm learning as well in my podcasting career is, making those personal, trustworthy connections is truly so pivotal. So I'm curious, Konstantin, if LinkedIn had somehow failed, I think you've mentioned in the past that the quote unquote consolation prize would have been the trustworthy connections that you made. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, I think the way we thought about it is we weren't sure if LinkedIn was going to succeed. So
Of
at one point, I
course.
made this list of 10 reasons why LinkedIn will never work. Which, by the way, I really recommend entrepreneurs do because
Yeah.
you're so excited about it, but you have to really put yourself in the shoes of other people who don't really understand your product, who may just give it a slight look at it, investors and others, people you want to recruit. So there was a real chance it wouldn't work out. By the way, that list, I'm not sure where it is now. I lost it in one of the moves, I think. But we definitely, I felt like we wanted to start. I wanted to start LinkedIn because I felt like I would be really upset if someone else did this,
Yeah.
because I really wanted it to happen. I felt like I knew enough to make it happen, and even though I knew there was a good chance it wasn't going to work, I really wanted to work on this project, kind of like with the actors. This is the one movie I want to make, even though
Hmm.
I'm not sure if there's going to be a big audience for it. So now I thought there would be a big audience. I thought it would be successful, but realistically, the chances of a startup succeeding is kind of small, kind of low. And so what we thought about is, our contacts we already have. Of course, in the course of working together on LinkedIn, you form new connections. But the thing that even if the whole network isn't growing, we actually talked about we just keep the servers running for the network we already have. And as long as it has not only my trusted connections, but the connections of my connections,
Hmm.
that would be so helpful. Like, I don't need a million or billions of people on LinkedIn. The most important people are really that my contacts are on it and their contacts are on it, and everything
Right.
else is kind of gravy. So that was sort of the backup plan to use it for our own careers as a special tool that maybe not everybody had access to,
Hmm.
and to be able to um, be more efficient in terms of leveraging that investment of trusted contacts that we all have in our career.
That makes so much sense. And that really hones in on what you said earlier that as an entrepreneur, it's so important to work on a personal problem. And that even if this failed, you would somehow still benefit from what you had created.
Yes, and I think also just sleeping better at night, saying like, okay, like I tried it, it didn't work. It's
Yeah.
sort of like maybe you want to run a marathon or something like that,
Hmm.
and some people might say, oh, I don't know if I'm ready, and just never do it or even try it.
Hmm.
And then maybe at some point, with the age, they really can't do it anymore, and they might have
Hmm.
that regret. I wish I had. I don't know if I ever could have run it or not, but I wish I could have done it. And I think, if you want to try to run this marathon, and you can invest some time practicing for it, even if you don't make it, of course, you really want to make it. But even if you don't make it, at least you tried, and because of your bad knee, you just can't do it. But
Right.
you gave it your best, and I think that's more satisfying. Of course, some people don't make it the first time, and then they adjust their training program and work on their nutrition and their routine, and maybe make it work the second time. And that
Right.
happens to a lot of people who start startups. It's not the first one that succeeds.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, the marathon is a little more predictable. What you can do. With startups, there's so many external factors that just things may not work out, and that's very
Right.
important. But you always, just like with any job, you have a new network of people that you work together with. And working at a startup gives you much more intense connections, I think, than working at a 30,000 person company. Because if you're just 11 people, you really kind of get to know each other, and you're sort of fighting against the rest of the world to convince them what
Hmm.
you're doing is important.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of those, really trustworthy connections that, you've made over time at your, smaller company startups, um, you know, building off of that trust idea, I think one of the original names of LinkedIn was Trust Network or Well Connected, right?
Yes, that's right. So
Yeah.
we actually tried to get well connected, but some Cisco dealer who was doing, networking software had it, and we were only going to spend at most $5,000 for it, so he didn't
Yeah.
want to sell it for 5,000. So we said, okay, forget it. We'll come up with a new name.
Yeah. And I think you had, kind of mixed feelings about the word linked. How do you feel about the word linked today after seeing how much success you've had with LinkedIn?
Yeah, so we literally sat around. It wasn't just me; it was the whole team. We sat
Yeah.
together and we came up with different names that we could be, and we really, because a startup is so important to move forward, and so some people get really stuck on naming the company. And we literally just had one meeting where we looked at the different options. We all like the word "in" because it kind of has that emotional. People want to be in. Linked sort of made sense because we wanted to show something about the network, and it had to be a short word. So linked was sort of the shortest word we could find, but it felt a little not human. Linked is sort of
Mhm.
like web pages are linked, not people are linked. People are connected. So, but
Right.
connected in is just awkward to say and kind of
Too
long.
long.
So we just went with linked. And, we believe that most brands, if you have a name, especially if it doesn't mean something specific, like trust networks mean something specific, but it's also kind of easy to forget it. Like, what was that company? Important Networks or,
Mhm.
Trust Networks. So you really have to have a short enough name that people can remember it easily. And then over time, you fill that name with meaning. So LinkedIn
Mhm.
itself didn't mean anything at the beginning. In fact, quite a few users, we didn't think about it, but when they talked to us, they said, "Oh yeah, you're working on LinkedIn." So they
Oh,
didn't they pronounce it a different way. So we tried to make sure in the logo, when you see the logo, that linked and then in is a different color and a little different background, so people know it's not LinkedIn.
wow. That that's so funny. LinkedIn. LinkedIn. It kind of sounds like a German word to me, kind of. That's awesome. Well, LinkedIn, just kidding. LinkedIn started with a free basic, professional profile, which at first did not even include photos, right?
That's right.
Yes. And, every year, every few years or so, there's a new feature added, or at least it seems that way. I'm curious for you, how has LinkedIn changed from how you envisioned it or how you and the team envisioned it being used to how it's used today?
Yeah, that's a big question. Of course, everybody uses it kind of in a different way, which is kind of
Yeah.
the fun part of it. But initially, it was kind of that concept that we talked about. You have these trusted contacts, which could come from work, but they could also come from college or someone you take a trip with, or
Mhm.
family ties, and how you kind of being able to work with your network more effectively. But over time, and we thought like people, one of the concerns we had in the product design is that people will use that a lot, that they will see, oh, I want to meet this person because they have certain information, or I want to talk to this freelancer to potentially hire them. And the people making the introductions would sort of get tired of always making introductions, even though,
Right.
but that's also why we said only connect with people that you know and trust, which means in principle you're willing to introduce them to other people. So that was the idea, and we thought, people might get tired of making all these introductions, and especially since we allow people to not just reach people, your second degree contacts, but also your third degree contacts with it.
Right.
But then the interesting thing is very few people actually use that feature. I mean, I still think it's one of the most valuable features. I think it's vastly underused because that's how really things happen. But we noticed a lot of people, they just didn't realize how they could use it. It wasn't part
Right.
of the regular system. They were just kind of just doing their job and then only thinking about the network maybe when they're looking for a job or
Mhm.
something like that. So we had to figure out how we can build other things into the product beyond this core. We had the profile, and a lot of people, some people were very hesitant to put any information in there because before LinkedIn, everything was just in a resume. Kind of, we talked about the Rolodex, which is this private, thing that you keep your business card stapled into.
Mhm.
And the other thing is just your resume, and your resume was never public. So having your professional profile, visible by others was a, unusual thing to think about. And a lot of people are very hesitant about it.
Yeah.
So some people embraced it though. And they said, like I want to be kind of my own brand, like we talked about in that book. And so they wanted to add all kinds of things to it, starting with photos and work project examples and where they volunteer. So we added
Hmm.
this over time. And a lot of people, started looking up people before a meeting. If you had a meeting or a Zoom, and all of a sudden there's a name there, and you're like, "Well, who are these people?" And you just look them up. So they didn't necessarily want to reach them through an introduction. They just wanted this kind of a reference database of who they are. And I think today we're kind of at the point if someone doesn't have a LinkedIn profile, they're sort of slightly suspicious, like what are
Yes.
they hiding that they don't have one?
Right.
And it's also kind of an interesting thing about the trust is when you make your resume public as a profile, you're less you can't really lie about your positions very well because your own contacts are looking at it and they said, "Wait, you did not have that title. You did not work at the company then." But in
Right.
resumes, there used to be before LinkedIn a lot of resume fraud where people just invented positions and companies that they worked for because it wasn't something that was sort of peer reviewed. It was just something you only sent to the hiring manager who doesn't know you. And
Hmm.
so people would make up degrees from universities they didn't have and things like that. So I think that's a lot less now. Of course, there's all kinds of scammers who create sort of people that don't exist, and I'm sure that's something LinkedIn still has to contend with today.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So with LinkedIn today, there's so much more transparency. Like you
Mhm.
said, you can't lie about how long you've been at a company, and I think the second, and third degree icon at the top for me is a feature that I really appreciate and that I love. Were there any features for you that you expected people to love that didn't really sort of take off? It seems like one of those features was, introducing each other or
Yeah.
introducing two people that could benefit from this mutual connection. I don't know how to do that on LinkedIn today. I don't know if that's still a thing, but something that I've heard that people also have trouble with these days is actually finding the QR code on your LinkedIn profile.
Mm.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Like when you're in an
Yeah.
in-person event and you want to, share like here's my profile, here's my QR code, scan, we connect automatically. Apparently that's really hard to find for some people. Do you know where to find it?
Not that well either, because, when we started LinkedIn, there was really no iPhone or
Right.
Android, and so we just designed it as a website. But then, when these, smartphones became available, then we created apps, and
Yeah.
those apps create sort of new opportunities. So,
Mhm.
for example, like I think that's what people often use that QR code for. They meet somewhere at a conference or something like that, and rather than sending, putting the name in and then
Mhm.
sending, connection request, you just use that QR code like you do on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something that makes primarily sense because of the mobile use case. The other use case that, really became bigger over time that we hadn't anticipated was news because people weren't using the introduction feature as much as we thought they would. So we're thinking like, because we want people to come back on a regular basis, ideally daily, at least weekly. And what do
Mhm.
people do? And it has to be for people in all kinds of industries, all functions, all seniority, right? So people in a certain function seniority industry might do something and people in a different function seniority industry might do something different and country
Mhm.
as well. But news is one thing we found is very common, and
Mhm.
there's several kinds of news. There's industry news that people often check. If you work in the chemical industry, there's certain news about what's happening, and related to competitors. But you also want news about your own company, about other employees at your company that if you're a larger company that maybe got promoted. But also news about your personal network, where you see someone in your network got a new job or someone
Yeah.
moved to a different place. So having all that news together was something we figured, engages people on a more regular basis. And a mobile phone was really helpful for that because, as you know, when we work, we always have meeting and we have something to do. You never really have time to just sort of check LinkedIn unless
Mhm.
you have it for a purpose like looking up someone before a meeting or trying to get introduced to somebody. But the mobile phones could have created this, you have sometimes this you're waiting for somebody, right? And you've got like 3 or 4 minutes so people catch
Hmm.
up with news before that. Or maybe you
Yeah.
take public transportation, you just take that with you. So those are kind of use cases we hadn't really envisioned. And it'll be interesting how things change with these, AR glasses that are starting to happen. I could see that changing things that maybe as see someone at a conference or a business event, maybe it shows you, directly like what your shared connections are with that person or things
Yeah.
like that in
Oh,
your
that
glasses and nobody else sees it.
I don't know about you, but for me, that seems a little bit Black Mirror and a little bit scary. But yeah, in terms of the news, I think the news feature is a huge success for LinkedIn because LinkedIn really, you guys marketed yourselves as a professional site, a professional connect or networking site. And so when news is shared on that kind of platform, it's much more reputable. You can trust the news essentially. So I'm definitely guilty of, like doom scrolling on LinkedIn news. So I think that feature definitely still is very successful today. So I'm curious, when scaling the company, did you guys use LinkedIn as a factor in one of your own recruiting tools?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it kind of made sense, especially since we wanted people to work for the company, that
Mhm,
were using LinkedIn actively, or maybe using LinkedIn, came through us through an introduction.
mhm.
Because I mean, that was kind of because we were the company, want to make sure they're interested in the company, not just
Sure.
salary or being conveniently located to the house. Because I think being sort of aligned on the mission was really important, but also because it always worked really well for that use case. We just found it very easy to do that, and in fact, but we also have when we started the corporate sales effort, it was very interesting because we could see sort of at which companies already a lot of recruiters are on LinkedIn. So we kind of knew which companies to target based on, you know, the number of employees that are there
Mhm.
at on LinkedIn already. So our salespeople would go after those companies where, most of the recruiters were on LinkedIn and a lot of their own employees were on LinkedIn because we figured they're most likely to buy one of our corporate licenses.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, if you make a product, you gotta use it to prove that,
Mhm.
you believe in it. I felt like I knew the answer to that question, but I just wanted to double check. So, back in the early 2000s, you guys weren't the only ones trying to build a professional network. And with so many competitors in the market, what was the biggest challenge you faced in the beginning of LinkedIn?
Yeah, so a lot of people today assume we're like the first business network, but
Right.
that's not true. Like when we launched, there was the largest business network was a company called Rise.
Yep.
So that was quite popular at the time. There'd also been, several years before that, there had been a network called 6 Degrees where people are connected, to their contacts that way. It wasn't specifically professional, but there were other professional ones like Branch Out and Plan It All. So,
Mhm.
and there were some other ones that were really well funded who were coming out around the same time as us because what had taken off was really the social networking. There's a company called Friendster, was kind of the hot social networking company. And then a few years later, it became MySpace. And then a few years later, it became Facebook. So there have been several on the social side of companies. And I think even Facebook is now used almost more by people, my generation, and the younger people are much more on Instagram or WhatsApp or other things. So Facebook was smart to buy these other companies because otherwise they probably would have been replaced as well.
Right.
So that's kind of the evolution of how things, have changed over time.
Totally. And you mentioned, there were other competitors like Rise. I also found something called Plaxo.
Oh, yes.
Yes, it was like an online address book, essentially?
Yeah, and that was used by professionals quite a bit, and
Yeah.
the what we looked at, and when we looked, there's already other companies out there, we could see all of them, had some issues. So with Plaxo, for example, the people who used Plaxo really liked it. It was sort of you just you have your names of people, and then you basically get others to fill out the address book. The idea was that not everybody needs to keep. It's kind of redundant that
Mhm,
friend A has you in their address book, friend B has you in your address book. Why don't you just update your page and then A and B both link to it? So that was
mhm.
the idea. The problem was a lot of people who basically the work from me entering the information to my address book was shifted to you. And so that was great for me. But people receiving these emails updated, they didn't get the benefit of it because they weren't using it, but then they had
Right.
to update the address for different people or they're asked to join it. And so it kind of people felt it was kind of spammy. And that was really important to avoid. There's another competitor called Zero Degrees. They're very aggressive with sending out invitations. And so it was a fine line because you had to be kind of make it easy for people to invite their professional contacts, but you couldn't make it so easy that people on the other side felt this is some kind of spam thing that's happening. So
Right.
I think we got that line pretty well, and if sometimes we didn't get, we adjusted it quite quickly so that people it doesn't undermine the trust. And on the professional side, you had to be much more careful than the on Friendster or MySpace. Was sort of more people more forgiving if something is a little spammy. People kind of used to it. Oh, this is kind of fun. With LinkedIn, people were quite sensitive on the professional side. So I
Right.
think we try to the first step is really not the product itself, it's how you get to other people. So this what they call the viral loop was very important
Hmm.
to get that right because it had to work, but it also not annoy people.
Right. Yeah, and wasn't there a concept called fishbowl networking? Was that a concept that Reed came up with, and was that sort of a aspect of LinkedIn that, helped it succeed?
Well, so the idea of the fishbowl is kind of when people, so we always distinguish between a network and networking. So a network is the people of contacts that you have,
Mhm.
and we really recommend your network comes from working. These are the
Mhm.
trusted relationships. There is probably 5% of the population who are networkers, and they
Mm.
basically proactively network. They go to events or online to meet new people. Again, new people for a professional purpose, but they don't have something, they have not necessarily worked together with these people. And so that basically increases the number of your connections really fast. But since you haven't really worked with these people, they're not very strong connections, and it's hard to really keep up with all these people. So these 5% of people who are networkers, they sort of they liked at LinkedIn there were all these people that they had, that don't show up to the networking events because most people are not networkers. They don't go to networking events. At the
Mhm.
networking events, the networkers find other networkers. So they're basically stuck in that little 5%. They would network with each other, but the 95% were first only available on LinkedIn. Because
Mhm.
most people on LinkedIn think of it kind of as their office. They're not there networking, but they're just kind of, like you said, getting news, looking up a profile, and then maybe sometimes, see if someone can, has a connection to this company you want to work for or someone you want to hire to see if they could be a reference for them. So
Yeah.
so the fishbowl is really LinkedIn groups is the closest thing of a fishbowl that we integrated into
Mhm.
it. And that's what a lot of networkers use on LinkedIn because there you don't, you're just more free. Anybody can contact anybody else. And so there's a place for that, but that's not what the majority of professionals do. And it's also, I think not as effective. But if you have the right personality, very extroverted, you enjoy some wine and cheese, then, that works. So people really have different styles of what works for them. But it's the distinction though was important that we are not for networking. We are for managing the network you already have,
Yes.
which comes from working, not from networking.
Right. Thank you for that distinction. And so you mentioned, everyone has different styles. And fast forward to today, LinkedIn has more than 1 billion members in more than 200 countries worldwide, which is something to be hugely proud of. So I was wondering for you, Konstantin, how do you use LinkedIn today?
Today, actually, I use it not that much because I'm not actively working on any business projects. I'm
Hmm.
not trying to get a job. I don't work for any companies. I don't have, I'm not investing. So if I was
Hmm.
doing any of these things, I would use it a lot. And whenever I have something like that. So I do, for my guest lectures, I don't really need it. The professors just call me up and says, "Can you come in again?" But I do sometimes mentor, young students or maybe some people from Germany where I grew up with were entrepreneurs. And so a lot of these people find me through LinkedIn, and it's really helpful if they come through an introduction. I'm much more likely to, sort of write them back if a common, you know, colleague or friend introduced us, and this
Yeah.
person can say, because if everybody in Germany just contacts me, like, how do I know, like, which is a legitimate person that I would
Right.
find interesting? But if one of my German contacts says, yeah, this is someone that I worked with, or maybe an investor says, this is one of the entrepreneurs we back, would you mind meeting with them over a walk? Then, I'm much more likely to accept that. And then I can also look at the profile, and maybe I see we have some other things in common, or maybe they, lived in near where I grew up in northern Germany, or maybe some of their volunteer or nonprofit, things seem interesting. And I think we're humans. We look at the person too. Like, just we
Yeah.
have evolved like that to sort of trust certain people, or know, like, okay, this person might be someone that, I might get along with. I mean, that's usually not processed so much cognitively, but I think that, just some people will feel more drawn to, whether it's for work or personal purposes.
For sure. For sure. So, in my world of, tech recruiting and the tech recruiting space, LinkedIn is used mainly for sourcing top talent, obviously, sharing professional milestones, and organizing professional events and panels, and of course, reference checks.
Hmm.
Which brings me to my final trivia question for you. Are you ready for trivia question 3?
Yeah, I got two down. Let's see if I can keep the perfect record.
I think you can. I think you can. We're aiming for 100% here. So, trivia question 3. What is the unofficial practice of gathering information about a candidate or professional through informal channels? A. Silent screening. B. Backchanneling. Or C. Shadow reference.
I would say, what was the second one? What did you call that second one?
B. Backchanneling.
I would give that the name back channeling.
You're correct. 100%. Round of applause. Yes, backchanneling. This is a word that comes up in my day to day all the time. So, basically, to give some background for my audience who may not be in the tech recruiting space, backchanneling is basically when recruiters quietly ask around about a candidate outside of the formal reference check process. And, as someone who's worked in the tech recruiting space for the past 4 years, I have seen back channeling happen at all stages of the interview process. But it's especially detrimental at the offer stage, and it can really make or break a hire. I do have my own personal opinions about back channeling. I only have strong feelings about it if it happens before an interview. I
Uh-huh.
just feel like it feels sneaky and kind of unethical. But I was curious to see what major job sites say about it too. So, Glassdoor frames backchanneling as useful for getting to the quote unquote real story,
Mhm.
whereas OnRamps frames backchanneling as risky and unfair and reinforces bias. So, the tension here is really between pragmatism and fairness. So one sees it as best practice if it's done well, and the other sees it as, something to avoid in favor of more ethical, transparent methods. So I was wondering, Konstantin, now, we know exactly what backchanneling is. I was wondering where do you land on backchanneling?
Yeah, so I'm used to hearing, back in the day, we referred to backdoor reference checking, and we actually
Yes.
had a special feature called reference search. I haven't seen that, but maybe I have to be a recruiter, to see that function. But what it did is it would look at people who you overlapped at work with,
Yeah.
so that, you worked at this, you know, 40-person company, like the candidate worked there for maybe 3 years. This other person that or that your contacts know worked there for 4 years, and you overlap for 2 years. And then you can also see, like, I haven't seen that feature in a while, but you could see, okay, their position was this and the other person's position was that. So you could determine if they both worked, in sales or in marketing or at kind of similar level. Most likely they would know each other. So you were able to contact somebody not just out of the blue, but someone who you can reach through a trusted introduction and ask them about this person. So I think that is actually part and parcel of what we're trying to do at LinkedIn,
Hmm.
is that because when you there's something called game theory I studied at Stanford. And game theory basically means, how do people interact with each other? How fair are they with each other? How courteous are they with each other? And when they negotiate, how do they treat the other person? And
Mm.
in game theory is, if you expect to only have a one-time transaction. Let's say you are in traffic and someone cuts you off, like the Waymo did for you.
Yeah.
Um, that's barely a transaction, but
Right.
let's say cutting in line. Someone just cuts in line because they really want to get the better seats at a concert. They basically don't really care about the other person, because it's just another concert goer, and you're just
Mhm.
gonna do it once, and the benefit is you're gonna get a better seat, and who cares about the other person?
Yeah.
In the business world, the longer you work, the more appreciate, and a lot of young professionals don't realize it right away, that, let's say you have a meeting and you're getting a little upset at somebody, maybe you're calling them a name, or just, through nonverbal communication, something like that. Or you maybe talk bad about them behind their back. People often think that's like in game theory. It's like, oh, it's a one-off. I'm going to leave the company in 3 months anyway. Like, who cares what I say about the person? Whatever I want to get in the moment is more important.
Mhm.
One of the ideas with LinkedIn is that everything is more transparent, and what has happened in the past, this is why senior professionals often realize, if they treated someone poorly, maybe at a company, and fast forward 10 years, they're starting their own company. This other person became a venture capitalist, and now they're trying to, get money from them. And of course, that doesn't go well if you treated them poorly before, or you seemed, disrespectful or unreliable.
Yeah.
So often, what we need to think about is that the people we meet in business, at our company or through partners, it's not a one-off relationship. It's
Mhm.
it's probably many relationships. Someone might be called as a backdoor reference in the future. So that encourages good behavior with each other. Like, you're not going to be cutting in line, but it's more like you're going on a camping trip together, and you sort of expect to go on more camping trips in the future. So you offer your food to them, and
Yeah.
and and you do a little help them with setting up their tent and so forth. So that's really what LinkedIn encouraged you to see, really how small the world is, and that
Yeah.
you treat people well. And so I think in that context, back channeling works really well and to your advantage, because it'll help you get the job based on trust. Now, where it can be problematic, if it's sort of like an old boys network, where people just all we were all in the same frat together. So any Sigma Chi, I'll say something positive about.
Right.
But I think the people who are doing smart back channeling, they know that's not really going to help them figure out whether this going to be person a good recruit, just because they both went to Sigma Chi. Like,
Right.
it's really looking at the questions that you ask to find out, how do they communicate under stress, these kinds of things. And when you give people the when I often get lists of references for executives when I was hiring them,
Mhm.
I would pretty much ignore the list of references, because the
Oh,
list of
really?
references are the people that are only going to say positive things anyway.
Mhm.
I only have a certain amount of time, so I would only do my own backdoor references,
Mhm.
and it was actually really helpful. I would still ask for the list of references, because I know I don't need to call these people, because I'm going to not find out anything useful, so I can focus on the other people that they didn't list. And it was actually very interesting for me using LinkedIn. I could say these people overlapped at a company, they worked at similar functions, yet they're not a connection on LinkedIn with each other. That's kind of interesting,
That
because, like,
yeah.
why are they not connected? Now, it could be just they just never connected, or it could
Yeah.
be that they didn't want to connect for some reason. And so that's really helpful. So I definitely am firmly on the side that this is a good thing, but it
Yes.
needs to be used well. So, just like with any technology, you can use AI in a good way that's good for society, good for yourself, good for others, and ways that maybe not so good. So,
Definitely, I agree. Back channeling, when used properly, is a best practice if done well, basically.
mhm,
If, done before an interview, before you even meet the person, that might result in some conformity bias or, group think.
mhm.
But I think, after the interview, after you've already developed your own opinion about the person, it's definitely good to get down to that real story. And I like what you said about skipping everyone on the reference check and looking who are they connected with on LinkedIn. So I was wondering, do you think that online visibility via LinkedIn really pushed people. It seemed like it did push people to behave more ethically since we're less anonymous. But do you think that this was just a byproduct of LinkedIn, or was this something that you were intentionally working towards?
No, that was definitely intentional, and
Okay.
I'm still very happy today because you can see when you have anonymous networks like YouTube or, some of the other ones, just the kind of comments people make on posts are just not very, or Reddit or things like that.
Yeah.
They're not very courteous, not very professional. But in LinkedIn, because your real identity is tied to it, your professional contacts can see what you write. I think the comments on articles that someone publishes are often quite good. I mean, they're quite informative. People add information because they want to
Hmm.
also, it's all becomes part of their brand. So people behave, much better. And I'm very happy to see that. And so why, the using the real identities and real relationships is so important. Now, the people who don't behave well are maybe people who are just connected, who work in the numbers game, who are connected with anybody's, and if you don't really know the person, you don't care what they think about you, you're just trying to impress people like by how many connections you have. But that's also why we don't show if you have more than a 500,
Mm.
because we don't think it really matters if you have more than 500 or not. It's just an indication that it's kind of a real profile, that you can see, that this is not a profile that someone created, because that was frankly an issue in the early days, that sometimes people would create a profile that wasn't their own. So the favorite
Oh.
profile was usually Bill Gates. There were lot of Bill Gates profiles created before the real Bill Gates showed
Oh,
up and
wow.
and created his profile.
Wow. I did not know that. And that's cool to know about the 500 plus because I've always wondered that too. Like, okay, 500 plus. But yeah, that's, if you know more than 500 people, you're definitely a real profile. That makes sense. So, with online visibility, I believe there are two sides of the coin here. So, transparency and comparison.
Mhm.
When our peers' achievements are so public on LinkedIn, sometimes it can lead to a feeling of self comparison and self doubt. And I'm guilty of this. This has happened to me. So, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on LinkedIn's impact on mental health, especially on younger generations like myself?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a concern. I mean, I think it could be any generation.
Yeah.
But I think younger generation, because you grew up with things and seeing other people and maybe seeing it on Instagram, so then it kind of makes sense to carry that over. You're sort of more primed for it, and so yeah, I think that people definitely put their best foot forward on LinkedIn. They show off, their professional accomplishments, in the best way they can, because they know that can help them with their career, with future job opportunities, people accepting, their in-mails.
Hmm.
And so, when you look at yourself and you're just getting started in your career, and maybe you see someone else from your own school that already has had all these internships and all these references from people and is posting these, really thoughtful things. If you compare yourself, then yeah, that can definitely be detrimental. So I think that's something that maybe I don't know, maybe HR should be training their, employees a little bit on that, or parents with their kids, just like for social media, that
Yes.
what's healthy for you. But again, I think of technology, it's kind of like what I was saying, it depends how you use it. So,
Hmm.
like alcohol, for example. Now, alcohol doesn't have a lot of, I think for a lot of people, the negatives outweigh the positives.
Hmm.
But, I enjoy a beer every once in a while, and it's
Sure.
like a social setting. It kind of feels connected. You relax a little bit, so that's good. But obviously, if you have underlying issues where you're, want to numb out your feelings and you're drinking alcohol, maybe even by yourself, then that's a different scenario. And so that's kind of the same thing is, I think LinkedIn has a better positive profile than alcohol, but it's just any technology can be used or abused. And so it's our own responsibility to use it well, to realize when maybe something isn't serving our purpose well, to get
Hmm.
advice from others, and also pass that advice on to other people that you see that are maybe getting a little bit in trouble.
Sure. Yeah, you bring up a very good point. We need to be very aware of how we are using the technology and how it's impacting us, and it's our own responsibility to make sure it's benefiting us overall. I do believe LinkedIn has way more pros, and the pros majorly outweigh the cons. But even if, LinkedIn didn't exist today, like these sorts of self-comparison and self-doubt feelings would still exist with other networks, social networks especially. So I think this is something that, you bring up a good point. This is something maybe should be taught in schools to understand that everything you see online is everyone putting their best foot forward and is not necessarily like the reality, and knowing that you need to have your own self-confidence, and have that self-motivation inside yourself, and just know maybe everything you see online isn't you don't need to compare yourself to it. I've definitely made sure that I've taken some breaks from social media, due to these sorts of feelings as well, so I think it's something that just is a norm of today that people just need to be aware of.
Yeah, I think a digital detox every once in a while is a
Yeah.
good thing for everybody, to be not connected to Wi-Fi and to experience what you feel like. And I know some experiments at schools where it was a little hard for people at first, but then they
Mhm.
really felt a lot more relaxed. And I definitely agree. School should be, I think a lot of the stuff that people learn in middle and high school is really not that important anymore. So they should really kind of get rid of half of that and add some new topics like
Yeah.
media literacy, social media literacy, increasingly, what prompts to, use with AI, what might be helpful for you or not, because some people are losing touch with reality when they
Yes.
engage with AI and because the AIs are, more emotionally responsive that sometimes people, yeah, just, start forgetting that this is just some software over there, or that they maybe compare their real friends, with AI responses and realize that, or feel their friends come up short. So they
Right.
compare their friends to AI. So all these things I think would be good to study. The other thing, though, I think would also be good to let people know how to create an effective profile and how to post. So not just looking at
Mhm.
others, but what you should do. And I know with LinkedIn, when people just post like, oh, look at this, I got this, and I'm doing great, I'm doing that, it really doesn't help your brand very much because a lot of
Mm.
people see it as very superficial. And what we care about, other people care about, is, oh, there's an authentic human being. And so, sort
Yes.
of admitting sometimes that you're struggling with something or asking a question, like some professionals are hesitant. In fact, at LinkedIn, we had LinkedIn Answers. We had a product for a while. It was very good. Like once people ask questions, there are a lot of people answering it. They're very high quality, kind of like a Reddit or
Yeah.
Quora. The problem was that the responses were great and there were many responses because people wanted to respond in a way that showcases their knowledge. They weren't going to be snarky or things like that. The problem was we didn't have enough people asking questions because people felt, as professionals, you know, you don't want to be a web designer and then ask this question about how to use this common web design tool because it makes you look like you don't know anything.
Sure.
So, but the reality is by asking questions, you're demonstrating that you are a lifelong learner, which we all need to be. So I think sharing some vulnerability, asking questions is a very good thing rather than sort of celebrating and high-fiving yourself online.
I will definitely keep that in mind for when I post on LinkedIn in the future. I haven't posted in a while, but definitely keying in on authenticity and being vulnerable can make a huge impact on your brand. So that's great advice for anyone who uses LinkedIn, and especially, my listeners are mostly, Gen Z or Zillennials like myself. I like to call myself a Zillennial. Um, yeah, and, in terms of offline and online connections, I know we were talking about that earlier. It almost did not click in my mind that during the pre-digital era, all methods of meaningful connection were in person,
Mhm,
or as some like to call online. I mean, offline.
mhm.
And what I mean by offline, like we said, lunches, having coffee, going on walks, all normal things you do with people in person. And I definitely wanted to mention that today people online sometimes reach out cold on LinkedIn. Like
Mhm.
when literal strangers message me on LinkedIn asking for job referrals. And you might not believe it, Konstantin, but I have seen this strategy actually recommended to my generation.
Mhm. Uh-huh.
And I believe that you can't have online connections without offline in person as well, especially if you want them to be strong, trustworthy connections. So I was wondering, how do you think people should balance offline trust building with online networking?
So the way I think of it, the buckets are either is it trusted, and so trusted can be online or offline, right? Like I mean, you maybe build the connections offline, but then you're using online tools like LinkedIn to kind of nurture these connections over time, and
Hmm.
sometimes ask for those referrals. So I think that's one bucket, and that's for the most part the preferred and more likely to succeed. But you will sometimes have something where, you don't have a connection, to the person. And, it's also really important to be able to be effective in that situation, to be able to contact someone directly. What you really need to do, and I think a lot of people, when they do that, they focus on themselves. So they say, oh, you know, I would like this job, or I would like to talk to you about that. I sometimes get these, messages and say, I'd like to pick your brain. And I think about, have people thought about it? How does that come across? Who wants their brain to be picked? I mean, just
Right.
imagine that visual. I'm just this bird like going through my skull. So
Right.
that is, what you really need to do is you need to think about what you can offer to the other person, which
Hmm.
means you first need to understand what they want. So LinkedIn profiles are great for that because you have so many different ways of kind of hooks that you can relate to them. You can maybe you went to the same school, right? You can mention that. Or maybe you were at the rival school. You can kind of crack a joke about that. Or maybe, they started off their career, they had the same position that you have now,
Hmm.
early on. You can relate to that. Maybe you see they used to work live in a certain part of the country, that you are in now, even though they're now in a different place. Maybe they have similar philanthropic interests. So when you
Hmm.
contact them, let's say someone supports battered women, right? If you just contact them, the key part is to actually focus on what you want to talk with them about, but to highlight why should they be interested. So phrase it from their perspective. Why would they want to spend 10, 15 minutes? What can you offer them? So if
Hmm.
you're applying for a job, like I actually had, it's interesting, we were using Netflix earlier in the conversation. One of the people I interviewed was somebody who, he said he got his job at Netflix because he told them, like, when I'm applying, is, I'm a really avid user and I have this list of 5 things that I think could make your service a lot better. And he said people, called him in for the interview because they thought, like, this person, even if the interview doesn't turn out, maybe we'll get some. This is in the early days when Netflix was still pretty small. We'll
Hmm.
get some useful feedback. So
Sure.
this person was trying to offer whatever they could to someone else rather than, say, hire me. But let's say even that is challenging. Well, then maybe you shouldn't be contacting the person. If there's only something in it for you and nothing for the other person, maybe you shouldn't be contacting them. But let's say you don't find a direct route, you don't find like commonality, you don't find something to offer, but let's say they have this on their profile, they're supporting battered women. And they said, I'm contacting you. And because, it matters a lot, I know your time is very valuable. I just donated $20 to the Center for Battered Women.
Mm.
That person is probably more likely to answer, right? Because
Right.
they care about something that you care about. They showed some action, they put some skin in the game, that they're not just contacting thousands of people, but they're really looking at your profile and they care about what you care about. So you're like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. People are more likely to respond if number one, you know what they want. And
Mhm.
number two, if you can offer them something in that sort of realm of what they want. So now that we understand the how behind meaningful and trustworthy connections, I want to dig deeper into the who.
Okay.
And I know that you've said one of the most common questions you get is, who should I connect with on LinkedIn? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you've said one of your philosophies is it's not about having thousands of contacts, it's about trusted connections. A good introduction is one where both people can thank you afterwards. And I know that's something, we've talked about here in this episode today. I would love for you to share a moment where this philosophy really came to life. Could you think of one?
Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah. I mean, it happens so many times. I mean, we
Yeah.
could spend an hour, and that's really what encouraged me all the way in the early years of LinkedIn, that I saw when people really tried to use it, how well it worked. So actually, I'll tell you about the very first introduction request that I received. Was I It was a Stanford friend of mine, and she said, "Could you introduce me to this, other friend of mine?" And I know they didn't know each other at all, and she actually was doing it on behalf of her husband. Her husband, I think, wasn't on LinkedIn, but she was trying to help him.
Yeah.
Obviously, we do good things for each other in in marriage as well. And he said her husband was working in the law field and was working with like a Swiss company, but he just wanted somebody to translate some legal documents into from German into English. And this person that she, on behalf of her husband, wanted to reach was one of my contacts. And the interesting thing is, she in the past helped me get a significant client.
Hmm.
So now I was able, without having to do anything, kind of give her a lead for a client. And it was kind of like a win-win, because I was like, okay, I feel so much better that I'm able to do something for her. I didn't have to work very hard. I just had to, pass on this introduction and let them know, who this person is, why I thought they might be a good client for her. Because sometimes people are bad clients, right? Like if you're in
Hmm.
a service business, I mean, people that don't pay you, or they just try to, just make it very difficult to work with, or unpleasant, or have unrealistic expectations. So, I was able to tell her, like, and also my friend, once they work together, they're much more incented to be ethical, because otherwise my
Being
reputation would get tarnished, in the way.
right.
So this is an example where it's like a win-win, and it wouldn't have happened without LinkedIn, because even if she had asked me, "Do you know someone who's a translator?" I would not have thought of her.
Right.
Because I remember seeing that message and saying, "Oh, because, your contact can help me with translations." Like, I don't know any translators, but I knew her. She was mostly doing jewelry design. So I knew her kind of in that context. And so it's really hard to keep up with and to think on the spot of all when people ask you, "Do you know someone who does that or who knows this?"
Hmm.
If you have 150 people, how can you keep track of all the different things these 150 people are currently engaged in that they've done maybe 10 years ago? It's just really impossible. So that's an example. I mean, that was literally my first introduction I
Yeah.
made kind of as the intermediary on LinkedIn. I don't
How
remember what I asked for. I'm sure I pretty early on also, asked for an introduction, found someone interesting that I wanted to meet for a professional purpose, but I don't remember that one.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful story, and how compelling that it was, one of the first introductions you've made with the product that you had such a large part in creating as well. So it's clear that for you, it's never been about the numbers, but about trust, about the who. And when you scale that philosophy to hundreds of millions of people, it's not just careers that change, it's society as a whole. So, taking a look at the bigger picture here, you once said that you wanted to change the world. And in this lifetime, it seemed like the internet was the way to do that. Maybe in the 1500s, it would have been the government. And maybe in the Middle Ages, it was probably religion. So, my final question for you, Konstantin, 100 years from now, what do you think will be the most dominant force shaping our society?
Oh, can you give me a multiple choice?
Yeah, this isn't a trivia question. This is a philosophical question to close out the episode.
That is really hard. I mean, like, how could I know? Like,
Yeah,
because we only know. I mean, the story that it reminds me of, it's just so hard to think about how our world is going to evolve. I mean, sometimes I wonder if in 100 years, it's only like cockroaches running around on Earth, and
sure.
there might be some
Robots.
some other alien civilization that lives somewhere else or has taken over
Yeah.
here.
Just the
or,
Waymos driving
yeah,
around.
so that's it's really hard to know in advance because we tend to interpolate what we know now. So,
Yeah.
one story that I like when I was studying at Stanford about technology and adoption of technologies was, the advent of the video camera. So when they had the first video camera, of course, it was very simple, very, and so forth, but they basically said, okay, we know what this video camera is great for. Because, the entertainment that people were doing, they're going to theaters and operas. And they said, and there's many good seats, and a lot of bad seats, right? So not
Mhm.
everybody can have the third row center seat. In fact, only two people can have that very
Mhm.
best seat in a house. Of course, some people think maybe balcony is kind of nice, but
Yeah.
I'd say most people want to sit kind of like very close and have a great view unobstructed. They said, "Okay, we know what this video camera. We invented it so that you can watch the opera through that seat, and everybody else doesn't need to be in the corner and moving their neck around to see. They can all have the best view. No one's going to be in front of it, and that's isn't that great about this video camera? This is the future of video cameras." What they didn't think about is it took them, many years or decades to figure out that you don't have to put it only into a theater. You can use it outdoors. So
Mm.
and you can move around the camera. So you can have different angles and it's not a play. You can just have actors and do these things. So these things like, it's very hard for us as humans to predict what's going to happen with this technology. Now we have flashbacks in movies and forward, and we have synthetic characters and, all
Mhm.
these things are just unimaginable. So I don't really think I can answer your question, but I mean, I would just be doing like a little projection of what I know now, but,
Yeah.
100 or 200 years, I really don't have a great answer. I mean, my answer now would be something around AI and robots and, like maybe having superhuman skills and be able to fly like birds or things like
Yeah.
that. But who knows? I mean, maybe there's something completely different that we evolve into and how we connect, and maybe we go through some, maybe we don't all die, but maybe there is some significant event that changes that we are becoming hopefully less partisan in our politics or feel more the unity. I always think that, I mean, I think there's some movies about that. If we had a giant, meteor, trying, on collision course with Earth, I think all of us in the different nations who are like fighting with each other, would be working together to avert this meteor hitting us and killing us all. So events like that could be, I mean, actually, I got started in science fiction. So,
Yeah.
a lot of it was space travel. So I still remain very excited. I watched the different Starship launches and it's been exploding for quite a while now, but it seems like they're learning something. The last one was better. So I think that could definitely make an impact as well on how we feel. Because there's a Carl Sagan, when they, they pointed the camera back to see the Earth as just really this little pale blue dot, and it really seems to change, how people think about life. Or the
Yeah.
astronauts, when they look down on Earth, they just get a very different feeling that we get when we're on Earth. So I think our consciousness might evolve in interesting ways, but exactly where that ends, I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know, and there's no way of knowing. If I had to guess, I don't know. Maybe oof, I don't know how to explain this. I think, yeah, science fiction is definitely, or the aspects of that we see in science fiction today will probably play a part in the future. And there's this show that I really like called Upload,
Okay.
and it's essentially where if your physical body, passes away, you can still upload your soul into like another realm, basically. And that would be crazy if that happens for real.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. Like, can you transplant brains? Let's say
Yeah.
not even upload, but just physical brain. If you could transplant that into another person, do we become that person, or are we still the same? Because we
Yeah.
can transplant an arm or leg. In fact,
Yes.
I heard when they first did the very first transfusion.
Yes.
Until then, people blood, of course, is like the life force, right? So when people got sick, they would let out the old blood and put, to kind of let out the disease. And
Mhm.
so blood is the life force without which we can't be alive. So when they had the first blood transfusion, they were not sure what's going to happen. Does that person, like, if I get a transfusion, do I become the person whose blood I take in?
Hmm.
Because they assume that's where the true we is in the blood. And
Yeah,
it kind of makes sense. I mean, now it seems ridiculous because we're all going and donating blood at the bloodmobiles, and obviously all these people don't become us, and we don't become them if we need
right.
it. But so that's definitely, so where is the we located is a interesting question.
Yes, it is interesting. And I'm sure people 100 years from now listening back to this podcast will be like, it's so obvious. It's this and this and this,
Yeah,
XYZ. Yeah.
exactly.
Well, Konstantin, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been a phenomenal conversation and I've had so much fun.
All right. Thanks, Lena. Appreciate it. It was fun.
And before we go, I do want to congratulate you. You got 100% all three trivia questions correct. Congratulations.
They were not so easy, the 2003, 2004, 2005, like that
Yeah,
was actually hard because it's just 1 year apart. It's not like
right.
if it was 2004, 2010, 2020,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that would have been easy.
That was probably the trickiest one and good job getting that right. All right. Well, thank you, Konstantin, for coming on today. And thanks for those of you who made to the end of this episode. Thanks for listening.
Oh, and for learning too.
Yes. See you on the next one.
Okay.
If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating or thumbs up, follow or subscribe, and share with a friend. For bonus content, you can find Trivia Tangents on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and of course, all podcast platforms under Trivia Tangents Podcast. Check out our website at triviatangentspodcast.com to purchase trivia starter packs based on these episodes. Perfect for hosting your very own trivia night.